If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, and you really want to show it. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Good work.
Thank you, Bill. Professor John Helliwell from the University of British Columbia. We actually, some years ago, had John presenting with a neuroscientist from the University of Wisconsin by the name of Richard Davidson some years ago. And they also talk about happiness from two very different perspectives. And that was a very interesting evening. John, he is the Other Child Foundation Fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He's also the Professor Emeritus of Economics at UBC. He's also one of those academics who managed to win the Order of Canada as well. And he has worked with very eminent Robert Putnam, the author of Bowling Alone. So John and Robert Putnam have a lot to say about the concept of social capital, social good. One interesting thing about him was I think one of the work he had done was to actually rank Canadian cities as to how happy the citizens of that city is. So I think he found some very interesting data, and the happiest cities seems to be the smaller ones, and mostly concentrated in the east. And Vancouver is not ranked that high up there, as far as I know. So Professor John Helliwell.
Thank you, Victor. I'm going to ask you to help me with a little experiment that will, I hope, explain later. Are you happy?
Yes. Yes.
If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Now, to do this experiment right, you have to not just be clapping your hands, but you have to be singing too. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, and you really want to show it. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Good work. Now, here's part of the science of that. Are you happier now than you were 2 minutes ago? Okay. And the other part of the science is I'm going to take the view and have a lot that one of the things you need is the capacity to reach out and connect with people where otherwise, through fear or shyness, you draw back. So I thought if you saw an old goat making a fool of himself in public, in order to reach out to other people, you might be a little more prepared to try it yourself next time. That's the whole idea. There are 4 principal lessons from well-being research I can list for you. And one of them has already been given to you in some detail, that generosity pays dividends in terms of subjective well-being. I'm going to link that up a little bit with some of the other fundamentals. Another fundamental is that positives trump negatives. it's been only lately recognized in a whole range of curative and social sciences that we stop looking at depression and curing it and taking people back to stasis and arguing and trying to find ways of increasing positive states of mind, which research has shown are more likely to keep you alive and healthy than the absence of negative ones. So positives have a great value but are understudied. Criminology is all about finding and removing criminal behavior, not about the creation of positive behavior. Well, clearly that's what Liz and Bill have been at on the other side of it, and I'm going to take you there too. The third principal point is that the social trumps the material. And you haven't heard very much about that. There's a lot of experimental evidence of that side, that people systematically overestimate the life satisfaction they're going to get from material things, underestimate that they'll get from social connections, and so they end up making a lot of Faustian bargains where they work too hard, commute too much, spend too little time with family and friends. And the fourth is that almost all of life is local. Well, I can't take you through those because our focus tonight, and I've only got a very few minutes, is to focus on generosity. And how do these other parts fit into it? Well, I think they fit into it because once you start recognizing the number one thing I want to say with you, they both said in some sense you don't get enough of generosity. Liz says it's because people get a positive feedback from it, but they don't know they will. And Bill's in some sense saying the same thing. You don't get enough of the generous behavior because people will leave it to beaver. They'll leave it to somebody else to do it to some extent. Well, the way you get around that and the way you sort of amplify the well-being consequences is you get a supercharged effect from generosity when you combine the positivity and the social content with the generosity. You get spillovers between those three, and that's where things really can happen. Well, let me tell you two stories, but first I will note that in answer to the problem raised by both Liz and Bill, from a policy perspective, if you like, or a life perspective, we need reminders of one kind and another. The economists tend to think of price signals as the reminders. The burden of the well-being research in general is that it's the norms that really affect how it's what's the right thing to do that really governs what people do, much more importantly than the financial signal. So it's creating those norms in a social context that leads people to do the right thing. Well, the Dalai Lama said many wise things, but one especially is looking at the common and important elements across religions. The dominant one is the Golden Rule. Well, if you think about the Golden Rule, it is essentially a way of generalizing the need for and consequences of generosity. And a number of experiments by my colleagues and others have been focusing on the importance of reminding people. Let me give you a very particular example. This was Dan Ariely at MIT told us about this piece of research, where they had people take a simple exam and mark it and report the score. They showed a small tendency to mark in their own favor. It was only a small tendency because a big tendency would be dishonest, and they certainly didn't want to be dishonest, but there was a small tendency to mark in their own favor. Then they set up a situation where a control group was asked to write the names of the 10 books they'd most recently read. The other group was asked to write down the 10 commandments. And they subsequently were all asked to do the exam and mark it thereafter. Those who had been asked to write down the 10 commandments showed absolutely no tendency to mark in their own favor. Well, what that's showing you is that, in fact, even small reminders of these norms at the appropriate time are enormously important, either through the sign on the wall in this context or the writing them down. And so as society, we want to make sure that people have those opportunities. Let me give you now another story that's not as directly about giving, but I think you'll see that it inherently is about giving. because I'm arguing the supercharged generosity is people doing things together for others. There have been quite a lot of people studying the benefits of doing things for others. Liz and Bill's examples are important in that. There have been other people studying the benefits of social connections. This is the social capital side of the research. What I'm inviting you to think about is when those two get together, the really supercharged returns of doing things together for other people. Remind me later to come back how much time I got, Victor. You're the timekeeper here.
Could you say that louder?
He tells me he's louder?
Yes.
Louder and funnier? Tough game. I'm going to tell you two Charles Montgomery stories, and then I'll tell you about the elder care facility in England. Charles Montgomery, who's a writer and journalist here in Vancouver, can't be here tonight because he's off studying other cities for the book he's writing called Happy City, about how to make cities happier places to live, sat in for some time on a wellbeing research group that Liz and I and Chris Barrington Lee and others have at UBC. And so he understood that reaching out to others in generous behavior gave positive spillover. So he said, I'm going to test this out. And he was going through San Francisco airport, and he saw a woman with small children in bags trying to get from one gate to another. He said, I'm going to do it. He normally wouldn't, right? Most of us wouldn't. He had this spur from saying, yes, I ought to try this. And he reached out and he did it. And he helped them right across the airport. And the woman was so grateful and so happy. And it was all wonderful, but he came back and he said, I got a problem with this. He said, I had to say to myself at the end, I just did this because I thought it would make me happy. And so he was starting having arrière-pensée because he knew that this would make him happy. And I said, Charles, that's not the way of thinking about it. The way to think about it is you did that to help that woman. And you did help that woman, and you did make her happy. The fact that you happened to get a little reinforcing pleasure out of it, you should be able to say to that woman after that, it was a pleasure. And it was a pleasure, and you would mean it. Don't get angsting about it being selfish behavior. So we don't want to follow that route that says, do something good, get a well-being payoff, and make yourself happy. And it's then one more of these self-help books about how to make yourself happy. That's not the issue. What we're after is the more fulsome form of this, where he's much better in his second sphere about saying, I'm not doing this to make myself happy, I'm doing it to help that woman in the airport, and it is a pleasure to do that, and accepting that pleasure. Small change, maybe, but I think an important one. Well, the next thing he did, he was discussing this research around the table in the cooperative housing that he lives in Vancouver. This is before the Olympics. And they said, if this stuff is really true about, we ought to be able to do something for the Olympics on this. And so they developed a scheme called Home for the Games. Well, it was a very simple notion where it combined doing things with others, for others. So they set up a website whereby people would offer their homes for visitors to the games, and they'd get also advertised for people coming. So they said, in a way, it's like trying to make Vancouver into Lillehammer. Take a big city and make a small town with its welcoming mat out for the games. And the twist in this is that the deal was the people coming wouldn't pay an extortionate rent. They'd pay a sort of regular old rent. The people running the house would take that rent, and half of it would go to house the homeless. Now, the beauty about all that was, because the generosity was built right into it and accepted and welcomed and was the reason why they were doing it for most of these people wouldn't have even used their house on a rental basis, but the idea that they could use their house to meet the kind of people they would meet who would come on that kind of arrangement, and the people coming immediately, so the whole levels of trust, they had this, it wasn't as big as it ought to have been because it wasn't as well known as it ought to have been, but they had hundreds of these visits. He said uniformly, everyone was overjoyed with it. Why? Because, of course, they immediately came into the house knowing these were good people. These were knowing the kind of people they would like to think of themselves as and they'd like to be with. So the guests were treated as real guests, and everybody had a wonderful time, and money was generated for the homeless. So you created a social context where everybody felt good about themselves and they had fun. And at the same token, there was a positive spin over to everything. The mere addition of taking the commercial right out of it, by taking way more than could have been anybody's profit in any of this and giving it away, automatically made it something people were proud to be part of, rather than something they were worrying about whether the price was too high or too low, or whether they were making money or not. So I think it's a wonderful example. They, bless their hearts, are taking it forward to the 2012 Olympics in London. If you take that kind of example as seriously as I do, you immediately think of a whole lot of other spheres of life where generosity and social connections can be co-created in a way that makes everyone happy. One final story, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. And this is an example that comes from research by Alex Haslam in Exeter, where they had an elder care facility that had an unhappy floor and a happy floor. And so they deliberately did their intervention on the unhappy floor. They were moving from an old facility to a new facility, and they moved them across laterally, so they weren't changing the geography. But what they did for the happy floor is they brought in professional designers to design the social spaces they would be using in the new facility. And the unhappy floor, they said, design your own. And they had the same resources to work with, and they designed their own and so on. And then afterwards, the professional designers looked at what the people had designed for themselves and said, they'll never use these facilities. This isn't going to work. And of course, you've already guessed the consequence. The group that had got together and worked with each other for their own and other people's advantage in the future and made those social connections, their social spaces were used 50% more than the happy floor social spaces. All the measures of morbidity and self-assessed happiness went right through the levels of the happy floor and significantly above it, through that tiny little intervention of giving people just a little bit of incentive and capacity to unleash their capacities and to achieve the joys they could get by working together, playing together for some bigger advantage. Now, the generosity is not a necessary part of that, but it gives the supercharged element, as that Home for the Game story will tell you. One more example, and then I will stop, and this is the water club experiment. They also did the same team in Exeter. The people weren't drinking enough water in the elder care facility, so that, I'm going to finish the elder care story first because it's more fun. This was so important, I thought, that we brought this team over and had them meet with people running healthcare facilities and managing them in Canada, trying to get some corresponding research going in Canada. I think we've succeeded to get some going in Waterloo. But we had a meeting of healthcare facilities operators in Toronto a year and a half ago, and we presented this stuff, and we got to the end of the thing, and I said, you know, this is a big effect, but it's such a tiny little intervention. Think of what we did, something really serious. Instead of locking up old people in front of television sets, locking up kids with professional caregivers in isolated environments, we let the elder and the young get together and amuse and educate and live each other's lives, create families out of non-families, synthetic families that produce happiness. Wouldn't that be something really important? And the woman beside me said, oh my goodness, let me tell you a story. So she ran a big chain of elder care facilities in Ontario. We had a trouble last summer because most of our caregivers are women with children, and those childcare facilities get in trouble during the summer because they're linked to school often. And so what we did is we set up a day camp for their children in the elder care facility. I said, didn't that raise a little problem with the authorities? Well, she said, we didn't tell them all about it. But they did it. And she said, you just wouldn't believe the way in which the whole level of liveliness in the facility got up. And the really experimental aspect was they had 4 people in that facility who are called wanderers. Now, a wanderer is somebody, if doors are left unlocked, they'll go away. This was thought to be senescence, right? This was the idea. These are people who can't control their own lives, and so don't you believe it? These people were walking away because they didn't like it. You don't believe me? She said during the 3 weeks of that day camp, not one of those wanderers tried to wander. These were people whose lives were converted to something else by doing something for others. by connecting with others, by having an engaging life. And I must have used my 15 minutes by now.
Yes, but you started one story and didn't end it. The water club.
The water club. Can I tell you? No, and then I will shut up. The water club story was people in these elder care facilities were not drinking enough water. That was held to be that dehydration was a problem. So they set up a water club whereby they get together, and the purpose of this club was to drink water. And they drank the water, and they discovered indeed these people were a lot happier. They were healthier in these water clubs than they were before. And so they said, this is how important water is to maintaining your health, and it was ascribed as a health benefit due to drinking more water. And our friend said, well, we've got to be a little careful about this science. Let's separate the club part from the water part. So they in fact, had a water club with water, and then they had a water club without water. They called it another kind of club, and they had the water without the club, right? And you guessed the answer. The water club and the club that didn't have the water produced equally strong health effects. And the water had nothing to do with it.